And start broadcast.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can all see my screen. It should be out and available. This is Heather Woodward with W&M Environmental Group. I'm a senior consultant and have been working in industry for over 15 years, and then I worked for consulting for another 9. So I have made my way through several reporting seasons over the years. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And a couple of quick things on the agenda. First of all, if for some reason you can't hear me or you're having any technical problems, go ahead and type something into your chat button. Also, for questions, we'll be taking questions at the end, and I will also be asking Lance if any questions came in during. So if you have a question during a section of the presentation, at the end of each report that I'm going to talk about, I will see if there are any questions and then move on from there. So we have a lot to cover, so hopefully this will be useful for you guys. So the agenda is pretty much going to go in chronological order of regulatory due dates, and I'll run through some very high-level stuff. Again, in an hour, there's not a whole lot I can cover, especially in some of the more complex reports like Air Emission Inventory or the Toxic Release Inventory. Those two reports are incredibly complex, but so I'm just going to go over some high-level tips on those, and we will go forward. Throughout the presentation, I have quite a number of tips, and the first tip is don't be late, know your date. So here are the major reports. There are a few probably industry-specific reports that I'm not talking. These are just the ones that pretty much apply to all industries. The Annual Waste Summary, and the Tier 2 are the first two coming up by March 1st. The stormwater reports, these are multi-sector general permits. If you have individual permits, you may have different reporting due dates or different reporting requirements, but this is for the multi-sector general permit, is March 31st along with the air emissions inventory. And then the next big one is the toxic release inventory by July 1st, and the pollution prevention annual progress report also on July 1st. So we will get started on the annual waste summary. And the third tip that I have, and the first question you should always ask, is whether or not the regulatory report is even appropriate for you. Sometimes people jump into preparing the report without even taking the time to ask themselves whether that report is applicable to them in that particular calendar year. So the first requirement is if you're a small or a large quantity generator, then you do have to report. If you generate more than 2,000 pounds of a Class 1 non-hazardous waste, you have to report. So if you're a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, but you generate a lot of Class 1 non-hazardous waste, you're going to have a registration with the state and do an annual waste summary. And again, if you store volumes over what's listed in these bullets, then you also have to report. So if you're a conditionally exempt small quantity generator and for whatever reason you're stockpiling a bunch of waste and not shipping it out, you could potentially trigger reporting. So I would recommend that you ship your waste in a reasonable time frame. Something that seems kind of like an oxymoron is this no report required annual waste summary report. So if you meet any of the first 4 bullet categories, you have to submit a report to the state. But if you meet the next 2 criteria, like if you're just strictly a small quantity generator, but you don't trigger, the large amounts of Class 1 non-haz, or you don't store a lot of waste on site in a calendar year, then you can not have to go through all the details that I'm going to cover in the next slide. You can just check the box that says no report required and submit it to the state. Seems kind of crazy to submit a report to the state that says no reports required, but there it is. And talking with coworkers, we figured that that's probably so that you still get your $50 filing fee. So, and then if you generate less than, if you're a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, but you do generate Class 1 non-hazardous waste, and you don't, and all that has been recycled during the past report year, then you also can submit no report required. So that can help streamline it if you meet either of those two caveats. The next thing is pretty much data collection is pretty straightforward in the annual waste summary. You pretty much need your annual waste or your hazardous waste manifests. And you can actually start in that start early concept. You can actually start entering your manifest into the STEERS, the State of Texas Electronic Environmental Reporting System annual prep file. You can start doing that in your current report year so that as you go, especially if you ship a lot of waste, you don't have 500 manifests that you have to enter in January. You can do them every month during, say, if you're preparing a report for report year 2014, you could have started entering your manifests in January and February through the end of the year in 2014. So that can be very helpful. The other thing to really look for on your waste manifest as you get your top copy back from the TSDF is to make sure that they're putting your system type codes, the H codes, on line 19, because you have to enter that data into your annual prep file. And it's also helpful data for your TRI reports. So make sure your TSDFs are properly filling out that line item. You will also need an end-of-the-year inventory, and I'll explain that in a little bit, and your prior year's annual waste summary report. And quite often your broker or your hauler may have an annual summary for you as well. You don't have to, in your report, you don't have to include used oil or oil filters that are being recycled in your annual waste summary report. As a matter of fact, the TCQ will get kind of irritated with you if you attempt to put them in, so that doesn't get entered. And then some common mistakes. One of the big ones that I've seen through the years is not entering the waste that's stored on site at the end of the year. So technically, if you have waste in your waste management unit stored on site at December 31st of that year, you have to enter a line item in your annual waste summary report where the disposal facility would be your own solid waste ID number, and then the amount that's stored in your waste management unit in whatever pounds or kilograms or whatever unit of measure tons that you're using is entered there, and then the handling code is the 141 for storage, and then in the disposal facility it's your WMU's number, like Waste Management Unit 001. So you actually have to tell them that you're storing and how much you're storing on site in your waste management units. And I see that as a common mistake. The other big common mistake is the total quantity generated formula. A lot of people think, well, I've entered all my manifests in my annual prep file, and so of course I'm done, right? Because it automatically sums up and says I've handled, which is I've shipped, 10,000 pounds of this material. So why doesn't it self-populate that I've generated 10,000 pounds in a year? Well, it's really not how much you shipped in the year, it's how much you generated. So the real total quantity generated formula is the amount shipped during your report year plus the amount stored on site at the end of the report year. And if you've entered that properly in your annual waste summary report, it should self-total, and then minus the amount stored on site at the end of the prior year. So that's the total quantity generated. So if you had a whole bunch of waste stored on site at the end of report year 2013, and then you shipped it off in 2014, but you didn't have very much at the end of 2014 on your site, then your total quantity generated would be smaller than your total handled. So hopefully that made some sense. So again, I actually have clients who just at the end of every year do a complete clean out of their waste so that they don't have anything stored on site at the end of the year to avoid that issue. But also the total quantity generated does not include any portion of Class 1 non-hazardous waste that has been recycled. So if you've got Class 1 non-haz waste that you've sent off for recycling, you may have entered it in your annual prep file, but you can subtract that out of your total quantity generated. But you do have to include in your total quantity generated anything you have pending recycling. And so really the nice thing about this, or where all this counts, is your fees are based on how much you generate. So in order to get your annual fees to the state reduced, you need to make sure that the total quantity generated is correct. And the big resource here is actually to read the instructions, and that's tip number 4, is to read the instructions. I know, my husband always tells me I'm the kind that just jumps in and tries to figure something out on my own, and I never read the instructions first, but really, actually, it's probably a good idea, especially, this one's not that bad, it's only maybe 15 pages, so I recommend that you go off and download the instructions and go ahead and read them. So that was it for annual waste summaries. Lance, were there any questions that popped up that people typed in?
No, ma'am, there wasn't.
Okay, then we'll move on to Tier 2. The next one that's due is Tier 2. It's due March 31st. And again, the first question is, do I have to even report? And going through, it's probably helpful in this case to understand the objective of this report, so you understand what you're kind of looking for. But the objective of the Tier 2 is to notify emergency responders of any hazardous chemicals they're going to face if they have to respond to an emergency in your facility. So Tier 2 and TRIs are stemming from the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, and the Tier 2 is specifically for emergency planning portion of it, and the TRI is really more for the community right to know. And so if you're thinking about it from the perspective of a firefighter coming to your facility, they want to know how much and where they're going to be facing major chemicals. So that's why it's, if you have or store greater than 10,000 pounds of a hazardous chemical, or more than the threshold planning quantity, which is typically 500 pounds, but could be less, of an extremely hazardous substance, if you have either of those stored on site for any one day during the report year, then you have to report. The extremely hazardous substance is a laundry list of chemicals. The most common one that we run across is sulfuric acid. And in the resources section of this presentation, I have a link to the EHS, so you guys can look through that list of chemicals to see if any others are at your facility. So again, it's just trying to look at whether or not you store large amounts of any chemical or extremely hazardous substances. And the hazardous chemical is basically defined by OSHA. And so essentially if a chemical has a material safety data sheet or a safety data sheet, then it's pretty much a reportable chemical under Tier 2, unless it clearly states that it's not a hazardous chemical and or that it's not reportable under Section 311 or 312 of EPCRA. Otherwise, if you have an MSDS and the MSDS doesn't state this, then that chemical is technically on the report list, you just have to look and see if you have 10,000 pounds of that on site. And that's aggregate storage on site. It doesn't, there's no distinction with container volumes or anything of that nature like SPCC or some of the others have de minimis values. Tier 2 does not. Some other reporting exemptions are hazardous waste and radioactive waste is not reportable under Tier 2. And articles are not considered reportable under Tier 2. And the whole list of all the exemptions, there are several other exemptions, but they're not real common to everybody, so I'm not going to go into the details of them. But you can download, and after this presentation is done, Lance will be emailing out a copy of the PowerPoint to everybody So all these live links we will have so that you can access all these locations. So you'll be getting a copy of the presentation after this, so you'll have all this information to link to. So pretty much data collection here is relatively streamlined. It's just, your material safety data sheets and the inventory, your chemical inventory on site. Some reporting tips that we've run across. The TXT2 numbers get assigned by the Texas Department of State Health Services, and you get one TXT2 number for a corporation. And if you have multiple facilities throughout the state of Texas, then they all use that same TXT2 number. And that's nice. You can use that for helping with consolidated filing fees for multiple locations, if they have less than 25 chemicals that they report. So you can reduce your filing fees. So again, if you have one corporation, lots of different sites, they just use one TXT2 number. At this point in time, the Tier 2 submit software still does not automatically download or upload to the TDISH. You have to actually email them the file. Most, I think, local emergency planning committees can also accept an email copy of the software file, but we always include a PDF as well, because some, maybe in more rural locations, still don't have the sophistication of being able to run the software. And for your local fire department where you have to submit it, make sure you call them ahead of time and find out where and how they want it submitted, especially, again, in rural areas where you have volunteer fire departments and stuff. A lot of them don't even have the software capabilities to accept the file, so you're going to have to send them hard copies, quite possibly drop hard copies in the mail to them. So just talk to them. Bigger municipalities, maybe they can accept the software file. So just give them a call, and they'll tell you how to submit it to them. And as you guys all probably know, make sure you keep copies of your submittals, your transmissions, whether it's a copy of your email or green cards or certified mail receipts, to prove that you submitted to each of these three entities in your files. Common mistakes. The big common mistake we find is lead acid batteries. They are not exempt as articles, and that includes gel cells. Dry cell batteries are considered an article, but lead acid batteries are not. And they contain the sulfuric acid, extremely hazardous substance. So you have to kind of do a two-type review. The batteries in of themselves would have a 10,000 pound reporting limit, but the sulfuric acid within the batteries would have a 500 pound reporting limit. So you may not exceed the 10,000 pounds for your total batteries, but you could still exceed the 500 pounds for the sulfuric acid, depending on how much sulfuric acid content there is in the types of batteries you're using. The biggest place we see them that people overlook are things like electric forklifts or electric material handlers. Electric forklifts, the batteries run a good 1,500 pounds each. And then the rule of thumb of 18% sulfuric acid content really doesn't take more than, I think, 2 forklifts, maybe 3, to exceed your sulfuric acid threshold. So it doesn't take very many electric forklifts on site to exceed that. The other thing is a lot of buildings have battery strings that are uninterrupted power supply systems. So those are a couple of places to make sure you don't overlook that report. And there's a link for batteries and how to report batteries. Again, we will be emailing out these slides to everybody. So all these reporting tips and all the links will be available to you, so you can go out and download all this information. And so I've got links here to all the LEPCs, the fire department link, and the EHS list as well. And then contacts, I have to say Bernadine Zimmerman is excellent. She may or may not appreciate me putting her name out there, but she is very good, and if you have any doubts or questions on whether something is reportable or how to report something, she's always very responsive. So I recommend giving her a call. And there are classes that she is giving right now going on in January and February, and there's the link to the classes. And again, they're pretty valuable. I believe they're all in Austin at this point. Were there any questions on Tier 2, Lance?
No, ma'am, we're good.
Okay, we'll move on. Stormwater. This one is not all that complex, but it still has some pitfalls. Again, stormwater, and again, I'm talking about the multi-sector general permit, the TXR 050,000. If you have one of those permits, you have reporting requirements. If you have sector-specific benchmark requirements, or if you have sector-specific numeric effluent limits, or if you have if you haven't taken the waiver for the annual hazardous metal requirement under that, you're going to have to report either a benchmark or a DMR. The benchmark, again, is only required if you have if your sector that you're in has sampling requirements for benchmark. You have 2 sampling requirements in the year, the first half of the year, second half of the year. And you have to report to the state by March 31st, regardless of whether you actually collected a sample or not. And so if you have no discharge or no sample as an explanation, that's fine. But we find this is quite common when we talk to our clients that for whatever reason they haven't grabbed a sample and hadn't pulled the required samples. You have to go through and give an explanation as to why a sample was not collected, and you still have to turn in that report. So, sometimes you have to tap dance around that issue. And then you need to make sure that you are collecting your samples as you need to be going forward. So the discharge monitoring report, again, the annual metals requirement, which is applicable to all industries unless they've taken the waiver, is submitted to the TCQ only if you've had a violation, so you've exceeded one of those metal limits. Otherwise, you just retain that on file. You still complete the form, but you just keep it in your binder or your SWIP or with your records so that you can prove that you did complete the report. The sector-specific, if you have sector-specific numeric effluents, and that's for the sectors listed there, A, C, D, E, J, or O, then you have to submit that one by March 31st. Regardless of whether or not you had a violation, you just submit that one. Again, data collection, pretty straightforward. Any sample reports you've got. And then, let's say your sector-specific may require pH sampling or something. You need to keep those records and gather all those records together and fill it out. The benchmark, just keep in mind the benchmark is averaged across all outfalls. So if you have 5 outfalls, you take your 5 results, you add them together and divide by 5 for your first half of the year. You put it in the column that says first half. Then you do the same thing for your second half samples, and then you average those 2 together for your annual average. And it's the annual average that's compared to the limit by the state. So common mistakes that we see is discharge monitoring report similar to benchmarks. You fill that form out not by outfall but for the whole site. So if you look at your DMR form, there is no spot for outfalls. We've had a lot of people try to say, oh, I'm doing a DMR for each individual outfall, which isn't the case. So let's say you're a metals reporter, you do your annual metals, and you collect your sample for copper, well, all of them, but let's use copper as an example. You have 5 outfalls that you've sampled for copper. You would take the 5 outfalls and in the column under frequency of samples, you would put 5. And then and then in the column for the number of the analytical result, you would pick the largest, your maximum value. and let's say you had 2 copper results that exceeded the numeric effluent limit, then you would say I had 2 exceedances for the year. So that's how you would fill it out. You don't do one per outfall. Again, reading the instructions is always helpful, and be sure to check your units of measure. The discharge monitoring result report, the instructions are really pretty hard to find. I've got a link in here for the instructions, which covers that, how you fill out the frequency versus the number, the maximum number versus the number of exceedances. Also, for whatever reason, the TCEQ included the DMR instructions in the 2006 permit, but they didn't include it in the 2011 permit. So if you go back and find a backdated 2006 multi-sector general permit, the 050,000, and look towards the end, right before the actual forms that were included, the instructions are there too. And so, and the instructions are still valid with the new permit. So I'm not sure why they didn't include it in this next one. So that's another place where you can find them. Otherwise, pretty much here's a few links that may be helpful going forward. So any questions on stormwater?
There are no questions.
Okay, we will move on. This report, the air emissions inventory report, is one that is really complex. I'm probably not even going to scratch the surface of the tip of the iceberg on this. I mean, it can get really complex depending on your site, your industry, the types of pollution control devices you have, etc. So I'm just doing a very high level thing of some of the common stuff we see, but not in depth at all. So first question again is, do I have to report? And here are the reporting requirements. Again, if you're in the big one is if you're in a non-attainment area and you exceed the 10 tons per year of VOCs or 25 tons per year of NOx, then you have to report for your actual emissions. This is one that we see quite often where a facility is relatively small, may even be covered under permit by rule, but because their actual emissions exceed the VOCs, they wind up still having to report. So otherwise, it's based on your potential to emit according to this chart. Or sometimes the state will send you a nice little letter that says, hey, we want you to report. Usually that's for people on lead, for lead reports. The data collection, I have 4 bullets here. It's probably just a sampling of things. There's probably lots and lots of other types of data that you may need specific to your site or to your equipment. So this is just an idea. You know, obviously any chemical information, SDSs, vendor data, whatever you have on your chemicals, especially in your emission sources, any stack testing or monitoring data, production records, chemical usage throughput, and any spec sheets on your equipment. This is one that is really hard, really complex, and this tip of start early is really appropriate because it can take quite a bit of time to complete one of these reports, to gather up all the data, get it all calculated, and get it submitted. So if you haven't started already, do so. And then here's kind of what a complete emissions inventory includes. All of them are going to obviously include the submission, preferably via STEERS. I've worked with the STEERS program, and I personally like it. I think it's pretty easy compared to the paper versions. So if you haven't switched to the STEERS version, I would recommend you do so. And just so you know, the paper version, this is the last year the paper version will be accepted anyway, so you might as well get going on the STEERS. And then sample calculations will have to be submitted by everybody. And from there, if you have stack test data or relative accuracy test audits for SEMS or PEMS, any of those kinds of things you have to submit. If you made any EI structure changes, those forms would have to get submitted. But again, if you're doing a Spears version, it automatically gets submitted that way. You definitely have to have a signed certification statement, whether that's paper copy or your certifier is set up in Steers as a signatory authority. The other big thing is make sure if you have confidential information like process information, process flow diagrams, stuff that you don't want out for your competitors to see, you can submit it. They still want to see that data, but you send it to them in hard copy, and you have each page marked confidential. So you still have to submit it. Reporting tips, common mistakes that we see, and again, this is extremely high level. Anybody that's out there that's been doing this a lot probably could have a laundry list of tips or things that they see, that mistakes, pitfalls that they've seen, but these are just a few of the higher level ones. First of all is really getting your emissions inventory structure right to begin with. Making sure that especially if you're doing an initial emissions inventory, a lot of us are just doing updates so the structure is already in place, and this may or may not be a problem. If your structure is a bit squirrely, it can be hard to cope with, but if you're starting out, just make sure that you have your emissions inventory structure correct and accurate. I found it very helpful to sit down and literally draw pictures of everything before I put anything into the system. Because once you've pushed your structure up to the TCEQ, it's really hard to make any kind of changes. So just be very careful before you submit it and push anything. If you're working in Steers, you can leave things in your work area for a while, and you can make changes while it's still sitting in the work area, but once it gets submitted or transmitted up to TCEQ, it's pretty much there. We accidentally had a case where, we're preparing an EI structure, and, we were doing the EPN for paint booth, and it was going to be paint booth 1 or PB1, and it was capital B, capital P, capital P, capital B, and accidentally didn't take off the shift key, and so it wound up being, instead of 1 exclamation point. So forever and ever we have this PB exclamation point as our emission structure instead of PB1. Kind of embarrassing to see, but so just be very careful that before you submit anything, it's typed correctly, you like your naming convention and your structures. The next big thing is collective sources. Again, as you're setting up your structures, if you have a bunch of similar small emission sources, again, for facilities like ours that exceed that 10 tons per year of VOCs, but any individual little source really isn't all that much, and it's hard to speciate them out. In our case, we had a bunch of paint booths, so we were able to group the paint booths because they were all similar SCC numbers together, and it makes reporting and speciation a lot easier when you can kind of group a few paint booths or a few sources of your small sources together. And so I encourage that. You just need to look at the instructions for your geography and the instructions for what is considered a small source and when the grouping is appropriate, but it definitely can help with your reporting if you can group your small sources together. The annual emissions does include your authorized operations in your maintenance, startup, and shutdown, your MSF, but it does not include your emission events or any non-authorized scheduled MSS. So if you have an upset condition or a non-authorized MSS, those are reported in their own respective columns. Again, definitely read the instructions. I've got a link to them. These instructions are a little bit more lengthy. I mean, they're probably about 1 inch thick if you print them out, so a lot longer. But the good news is the instructions, very little of it, or only a small, maybe a quarter of it, applies to everybody. And then from there, they have a lot of detailed instructions on, specific types of control devices. So let's say you don't have any flares on your site, you don't have to read that section, but definitely read all the stuff common to everybody and anything applicable to your site for specific pollution control devices. Again, speciating your emissions, you need to definitely pick the most accurate contaminant code, and so if you have benzene, you need to pick benzene. You can't just pick VOCs. So definitely know also your speciation requirements based on your geographic location. Different areas, like non-attainment areas, have different speciation thresholds than non-attainment areas. You can get away with some more generic stuff in attainment areas. And then the other thing is the ozone season. It keeps shifting, but right now it's May 1st through September 30th, and I think it's been that for a while. And the ozone rate, they changed the formula, I believe, last year to make the denominator 153, just a flat 153 days per year, not based on your own production, but just left it at the 153. So your ozone season rate is in pounds per day, so you take the total amount of emissions that you generated during the ozone season. So the ozone season's May 1st to September 30th, and let's say your emissions, your emissions during that 5-month period was 10,000 pounds. So your ozone season rate, your ozone rate would be 10,000 pounds divided by 153 as a flat rate now. So that's that formula. So again, very, very high level, very cursory, but there's only so much that can be covered in this quick level class. Here's some great resources. The Point Source Emissions webpage is very good, and their emissions EI guidelines, which is RG 360, it's already out there. You can get that. And in case you didn't know or aren't already registered, the Emissions Inventory Workshop is next week in Austin. It's on January 14th is the actual workshop. And then on the 15th, they're having a series of webinars on how to use the STEERS program. So if you need extra help with that, then they have it set up as a side thing. So the workshop itself is on the 14th. So any questions on emissions inventory?
No, ma'am, we're good.
Okay. The next big bugaboo, this is one that we do a lot of at W&M, and yeah, June is a painful month for us, and June 30th and July 1st is kind of like April 15th for accountants. We're usually here and getting pretty punchy by the end of TRI reporting season. So again, first question is, do I have to report? The first question on that is my North American Industrial Classification System code for my facility on the TRI list, yes or no? You'd be surprised how many people don't know what their NAICS code is, so sometimes even just gathering that number can be a challenge depending on, but hopefully most of you already know what your NAICS code is. All you do is say, okay, here's my NAICS code, let's go see if it's on the list, yes or no. And then, do you have greater than or equal to 10 full-time employees? That's kind of a little bit of a misnomer because really the question is, does my site have more than 20,000 hours of operation time, of employee hours? So you may only have 5 or 6 employees at your facility, but if you have a bunch of off-site personnel that support the facility remotely, you could still get over that 20,000 hours. So it's not necessarily the full-time employee concept. And then if you say, yes, I'm in the NAICS code, yes, some people it's pretty easy. Yes, I definitely have. I have 100 people at this site. I'm well over the 10. We're good. So you check, yep. Then you start the next step, which is, determining whether you exceed a threshold, a reporting threshold in the manufacture, process, or otherwise use for a TRI reportable chemical. So essentially the next thing you'll do is download that list of chemicals. There's over 1,600 of them now on the list. And if you manufacture, process, or otherwise use that chemical, even if it's just a percentage or a constituent within a mixture of some type, you have to report on that chemical. The manufacture and process is 25,000 pounds. The otherwise use is 10,000 pounds. Unless it's a persistent bioaccumulative toxin, then typically those range from 10 or 100 pounds. So things like lead and mercury and PCBs and PAHs, not PAHs, PACs, are all persistent bioaccumulative toxins. Lead is 100, mercury is 10. And in that manufacture, so for this is the same slide, just pictorial instead of in bullet point. So for people that are more picture-based, this is the same thing, a flow chart that basically says, do I have a covered NAICS? Yes, no. Do I have more than 10 employees? Yes, no. Do I manufacture, process, or otherwise use more of over a threshold for a 313 chemical? Yes, no. The next part of this, the TRI reporting process is two distinct steps. So the first step is what I just kind of talked about, which is that threshold determination. Did I exceed one of those thresholds for a listed chemical? If yes, then I go on to step 2, which is to complete the Form R or the Form A report. But if no, you've got a whole bunch of TRI listed chemicals, but none of them exceeded a threshold, then you don't have to report. But you definitely need to keep on site in your files that evaluation showing and documenting that you did not exceed a reportable chemical threshold. And it's very important to keep that documentation, and I would say to retain it for 5 years. The legal requirement says you only have to keep your records for 3, but the statute of limitations for a TRI is 5 years, and I know Region 6 is big on the 5 years, so definitely keep your records for 5 years. After 5 years, you can go ahead and purge them. But again, I'd say half the battle in compliance, regulatory compliance, is proving the negative. So in this case, if you have to do that threshold determination step, you definitely need to keep any records. And so let's say you have 5 TRI chemicals at your facility, 3 of them are below the threshold, and 2 of them trigger step 2 of completing a Form R. You just need to keep on file your records for the 3 that don't trigger, and then you move on to completing your Form R, which is your release information. Where did it go into the environment? So again, just a pictorial version of what I just talked about. Step 1, do your threshold determination. And then after that, go try to figure out where it all went. Again, tip 5, definitely make sure you document this. Any report you need, and all along, but TRI really requires an awful lot of documentation. TRI also requires that you start really early, because this is, it can take a lot of time to gather all that throughput information and do all the calculations. So definitely want to start as early as possible within the year. And actually, I would say make sure you might even have started this in the report year that they're tracking data. Quite often we will deal with clients who you'll say, well, how much of this material got released, or how much paint did you guys use? Well, they don't have paint usage records, or they don't have chemical usage records. So we have to go back to purchasing records, which isn't quite as accurate because TRI is based on usage. So if you run into problems where you ask somebody, how much of this are you using, and they go, well, we don't track that, then what you might want to do is put in a process or a procedure so that record starts getting tracked right now, so that in subsequent years, the TRI report is easier to do and more accurate. So that start early may be starting in prior years to make sure you're tracking the data and you have data tracking techniques already in place. So again, the data collection is in 2 steps. The first step is threshold determination. You just need to know whether you have those chemicals on site, so you can determine that from like a material safety data sheet or other vendor spec sheets or whatever it is that you have, and any analytical or monitoring data possibly can do that. And then you'll need to know your chemical usage rates, whether that's throughput or production, however that is that you do it. Could be even purchasing records in some cases. So that's the first step. You only go on to step 2 if you wind up having to actually do a TRI report. In that case, then once you start having to complete the Form R, then you're going to need to know any off-site transfers, any off-site shipments, things like manifests. Again, if you have a broker that you work with for your waste disposal, they may be able to give you a nice, handy annual summary report of the amounts you shipped. Any analyticals for your wastewater, your stormwater discharge monitoring reports, any actual air emissions. Again, if you do the emissions inventory, then that one hopefully is pretty much just take the numbers out of your EI and put them into your TRI. It may take a little bit of massaging, but it should be a lot easier. Otherwise, if you don't do an emissions inventory, you'll still have to do an emissions release calculation under TRI, and you can use things, whether it's monitoring data or AP42s or whatever it is. On-site treatment of chemicals. If you do any on-site treatment, disposal, or recycling, any of that data will also be included in your Form R. So common mistakes, common tips, again, read the instructions. For TRI, this is even harder because it's a good 1.5 inch thick with really tiny font. But I again highly recommend that you read anything that's common to all industry, especially the definitions. You really need to know the definitions because it can really affect whether or not you have to report. And their definitions of manufacture may be completely different than your concept of what that is. Their definition of process may be different than what you think it is. So definitely go in and read these definitions. One of the things about manufacturing as well is you have to include coincidental manufacturing. So it may be that we have a client that makes bleach, and so they strip the chlorine atom from salt and then rebond it to make bleach or hydrochloric acid. And in that stripping process, they have chlorine on their facility for 10 seconds. So it's not there for very long, but it's still coincidental manufacture, and they have to do a TRI report. So definitely need to think about coincidental manufacture, and process includes repackaging. So if you are somebody that packages from a large tank down to smaller drums or totes, that repackaging is considered processing. So again, the definitions that the EPA has come up with may or may not mean the same thing in layperson terms. There are a lot of exemptions out there, and these can be very helpful, especially things like the de minimis and the article exemption may help you get out of having to do a Form R because you're properly doing your threshold determination. And if you take advantage of de minimis and article exemptions, you may wind up not exceeding a threshold and don't have to report. So definitely take advantage of these exemptions. Again, document what you do. Good records ensure consistency year to year, which is important because what happens with this data is it gets submitted through the TRI CDX and goes to a giant database in the sky. The EPA will take that data and come up with what they call red flags. So if one year you report a chemical and the next year you don't, that's going to be a red flag and they may come back and go, okay, show us why one year you're reporting, say, for cadmium, and the next year you're not. So you need to make sure you have good, accurate records to be able to show, okay, well, one year I barely exceeded the reporting threshold of 25,000 pounds, but this year I was just under at 23,000 pounds. So, okay, I didn't have to report. The other thing is don't reinvent the wheel. So if you have good records and you have good calculations and assumptions, you can just use those year over year. However, there is the caveat of every year verify that those assumptions and calculations are still valid for your current operations. Don't just go, oh, we've always done it this way, so it's got to be right. Go back and double check, make sure that the assumptions are still valid, that you don't have any new analytical reports or any new stack test monitoring data or whatever it is. Make sure that whatever you're basing your calculations on is still valid. Again, record and keep all your calculations and all your basis so that you can make sure it's accurate, again, year over year. Keep reports for 3 years, but I'd say keep them actually for the 5 years for the statute of limitations. Another thing that gets harped on is this concept of not applicable versus zero. Not applicable means that it cannot happen at your facility. It's just not possible for that release to occur, or even it's just not possible. Whereas zero means that you could potentially have that material, say, in your wastewater, but if in such trace amounts that you know it's going to be less than a half a pound. So so that's the difference between not applicable and zero. So make sure you are appropriately choosing those. And then the last thing is data precision. Again, they talk about this a lot in the TRI workshops I've attended, which is use the report ranges. If you have a non-PBT chemical, you can use the ranges, the A, B, and C ranges. Definitely use those, and that's if you have essentially less than 500 pounds of a release. And round to 2 significant digits, again, for non-PBTs. They talk about this rounding concept because a lot of these estimates and a lot of the data and the numbers that you do, you can pop them into an Excel spreadsheet and come up with 20 decimal points. But unless your basis of estimate is really accurate, 20 decimal points isn't as scientifically accurate. So your rounding should be based on how accurate the input assumptions are and how you're making your estimates. Sometimes you've got exact data, in which case you can round to more significant digits. But in a lot of cases, the data is pretty accurate, and I guess you're supposed to get to within 10%. So again, they encourage the rounding to 2 significant digits at the EPA. So here are some resources that are available for TRI. Again, they have a tremendous amount of guidance documents out there, and both industry-specific and chemical-specific, so you can look at those and read through those. The EPA Region 6 has annual training, at least they have for the past several years, both in-person live training and webinar-based trainings. They take place usually in April-May timeframe, so keep your eyes out for upcoming training by EPA Region 6. I've always found those to be extremely useful training classes, and we usually go every year just as a refresher for what we have chosen to forget, because once we've gotten through these, we try not to think about them again for another year. So, any questions on TRI, Lance?
Yeah, I do have a couple of questions. When does the 10 full-time employees count? Say we had over 10 for a couple of weeks, but back down the rest of the year.
At that point, you would need to calculate the the 20,000 hours in the year. So if you had over 10 for a couple of weeks and then went back down below that, you would want to look at actually comparing it to the 20,000 hour for the year.
Okay.
So go ahead.
And the second question is from James Colella. Article exemption, does alkaline cleaning of a metal part cause the exemption to be void?
It depends on whether the cleaning process would remove, strip any part of that material or change the function or the form of that article. So if it's just like a soap cleaning where it doesn't, on metal where, you're just taking off oils and greases, but you aren't changing the shape or the form of the article, and you are not causing any, it's essentially less than a half a pound of release coming off of that chemical. Let's say it's metal, and you're washing it in essentially a detergent, and you're just getting oils and greases off, and the base metal, which is really your TRI article, isn't being changed in its form or shape, then you're probably fine. But if there's any etching or stripping that's coming off, you may be negating your article exemption. If you have more questions on that and you want to call me afterwards or some other time to really talk through your specific process, I'd be happy to do that in that particular case, because I'm not really sure exactly what's happening in that case.
Okay. Jeb Evans asked, is saving data and paperwork 5 years good enough for all types of state compliance? I am very new at this. My prior compliance guy has stuff dating back to the early 90s.
The answer to that question is nobody really has a complete answer. I would say 5 years. You have to look at each regulatory program has their own retention requirements. So you have to look at every single program to see what legally is required, and then look at the statute of limitations. So something like TRI and stormwater and stuff, I would say 5 years. For stormwater especially, you need to keep it through at least the current permanent cycle, maybe one permanent cycle before that, and then, yeah, definitely get rid of anything that's more than 10 years old for sure. However, records retention in the environmental world because environmental liabilities last forever, especially in the waste world, I would recommend never getting rid of things like annual waste summary reports or hazardous waste manifests, because technically your liability for your waste and your waste disposal never goes away, whereas something like stormwater, TRI, etc., keeping things for only the 5 years may be fine. But again, part of that whole records retention thing is a risk liability question that you may want to talk to somebody in your particular legal staff as to what your company's records retention policy is relative to legal liabilities.
And what are the penalties of misreporting?
Pardon, I didn't hear that one, Lance.
What are penalties of misreporting?
Again, that depends on the program and the regulatory arena, but so each regulatory area can have different penalties and different assessments. The fines can range up to, I think, $25,000 per day per misviolation. So you can have pretty good fines. I know that EPA and TRI, they tend to be, if you aren't reporting properly, they tend to issue fines a little bit more readily than some of the other programs like Annual Waste Summaries. So there can be pretty significant fines.
And there were a couple of questions, and I apologize. Earlier I was looking in the wrong section, so I apologize for this. We are going to be sending copies of this out after the presentation. That has been a question. And then Mark asked, and I'm not sure what section this was in, Heather, if I have over 500 pounds of lead acid batteries containing sulfuric acid, will Tier 2 reporting be triggered?
If you only have 500 pounds of batteries, then most likely your sulfuric acid content will be less than 500 pounds. So it's kind of a two-step assessment. The batteries in and of themselves are compared to the 10,000 pounds, but then the sulfuric acid content within the battery is compared to the 500 pounds. And so if you go through the rule of thumb of 18%, the 18% rule of thumb content of sulfuric acid within a battery rule of thumb, and that means if you have basically 2,750 pounds, give or take, of batteries, then you're probably going to exceed that 500-pound threshold of sulfuric acid. So again, you can get material safety data sheets specific to your batteries from your vendors. So you can get the make and the model of the battery, say, out of your forklift or off of your thing. Or when we send this out, you'll have a link to the guidance which talks and walks you through all the various formulas on how to calculate the sulfuric acid within your batteries. And their rule of thumb, if you don't have an actual material safety data sheet, is 18%.
One more question. Please repeat, actually two more questions. Please repeat what DMR refers to.
Oh, I'm sorry. DMR refers to Discharge Monitoring Report.
Okay. And Jeff wants to know, can you define what local means for the fire department?
Local, I believe, means the one that's going to be responding to your facility. So if you call 911, which fire department is going to be the one that comes to your facility? So usually every fire department, the fire marshal will come by your facility once a year and walk around. At least in the bigger municipalities, they always do. So that would most likely be the fire department. But again, it's whoever's going to respond if you call 911.
And this one question we also missed is, who prepares MSDS and how quality is maintained?
I didn't hear that one, Lance.
It says, who prepares MSDS and how the quality is maintained?
The material safety data sheet is prepared by the manufacturer under the OSHA regulations, and so they are required to prepare them and be accurate under that regulation. So they have to, I believe, report chemicals, hazardous chemicals, down to 1%.
I believe that's it.
Okay. I didn't cover P2 progress reports, but I know we're out of time, and they're really pretty straightforward. You have to do a P2 progress report if you're a large quantity generator of hazardous waste or a TRI reporter. You're basically just reporting any metrics that on any reductions that you do, and the biggest thing is to make sure that you're reporting your metrics based on a production ratio, not necessarily a gross measurement. So you may have, like, 1 year you generate a certain amount of waste for 1,000 widgets being made. The next year you make 1,500 widgets, but your hazardous waste generated remained the same. Then technically you had a reduction in your hazardous waste, even though your gross measurement didn't change. So you can prorate. There are some great resources out here, and look for the fall workshops. And that's pretty much it on progress reports and the whole presentation, unless there are any other questions, Lance.
Nope, that was it.
Okay, great. Well, we will be sending this out to everybody shortly, so you have an actual copy of the slides. And again, call me if you have any questions.